My coworker spent 3 months mocking my body as fake plastic, so I handed her exactly what she wanted, a front row seat to her own funeral. Most people would have begged HR for help, but I knew the system was rigged against me from the start. If you think your employee handbook is just boring legal filler, you're missing the one hidden clause that can end a career in 60 seconds. By the end of this video, you'll see why you should never play chess with someone who has nothing left to lose, and how one highlighted sentence turned her promotion into an immediate escort from the building. I want you to picture something. It is a Tuesday afternoon. You are sitting in an office lunchroom, just trying to eat your food in peace. And the woman across the table from you, the same woman who has spent 3 months quietly tearing you apart in front of every single person you work with, looks you dead in the eye, gestures at your chest, and says, "You'd know all about being shallow." And she smiles when she says it. That was the moment I made my decision. Not to fight back, I had already tried that. Not to go to HR, I had already figured out that road was blocked. What I decided, in that exact moment, was to follow every rule, use every word in my contract, and let the system do precisely what it was designed to do. She thought she had me cornered. She had no idea she had just handed me everything I needed. But to understand what happened next, you need to understand what I was actually protecting and why I had been protecting it so carefully for 4 years. When I was 24 years old, I lost my mother. She had been fighting a serious health battle for years, the same kind that had already taken both of my grandmothers before her. When she was finally gone, I was left standing in a hospital corridor trying to figure out how to breathe without her in the world. I was not just grieving. I was terrified. Because of my family history, my doctor strongly recommended I come in for a screening. I went, and what they found stopped me cold. The cells in one of my breasts that, given everything behind me, the specialist said carried a high risk of turning into something that would not give me a second chance. They laid out my options. I could come in for monitoring every few months and wait, knowing I might just be sitting in that chair for years watching a clock run down. I could have one side removed and continue monitoring the other. Or I could take the most permanent route to remove all of the tissue, eliminate the risk entirely, and never have to sit in that waiting room again wondering. I chose permanent. I do not regret it. But I was completely unprepared for what came after. The scarring was far worse than I had been told to expect. 2 raised, jagged, bright pink marks on either side of my chest. Each one impossible to look at without feeling the full weight of everything that had led me there. And I will not dress up what happened to me after that surgery, because dressing it up would be dishonest. I fell into a darkness so deep that I stopped leaving my apartment entirely. I took down every mirror. I felt physically ill looking at my own reflection. That did not go away on its own. It did not go away for a long time. I started seeing a therapist. And here is something I rarely admit out loud. I still feel a flicker of embarrassment saying this even now, which tells me the person I was back then is still somewhere inside me. I was 24 years old, and I could not get through a morning without sitting on the bathroom floor first. That was not strength. That was survival. My therapist eventually referred me to a plastic surgeon. The topical treatments they tried first did not work. The alternative procedure carried risks I was not ready to take on. So I chose implants, not to fit anyone's standard, not for any reason I was a single person on this earth an explanation for, but so I could look at myself and see a person instead of a scar. It worked. Slowly, then completely, my life came back to me. And for 4 years after that, I kept the full story private. Because it was mine. I had earned the right to hold it quietly. And I was not going to hand it over to anyone who had not earned the right to hear it. I should have known someone was going to take that choice from me. Her name for this story was Jill. And I want to be clear about something. Jill was not the villain you would have cast if you were writing this yourself. She was not loud. She was not obviously cruel. She was the kind of person who had mastered the particular art of being liked, to dry humor, easy confidence. The kind of social intelligence that makes everyone around her feel like they are in on the same joke. She had positioned herself carefully in our office, close to management, closer to HR, in an office of 45 people. That kind of positioning gives you a reach, and Jill was not shy about using it. I had no issue with Jill before any of this. That matters. She found out about my implants completely by accident, a close friend of mine. Someone who had known me since long before any of this happened. Made an offhand joke while we were planning a trip together. Jill was standing nearby, close enough to hear. By the end of that workday, the entire office knew I had had what everyone was calling a boob job. 6 people confirmed independently that Jill was the one who had told them. She never asked me why. She never asked me anything. And then the comments started. Quietly at first, then constantly. What Jill did not know, what she could not have known, because she had never once thought to ask, was that she had just made the single most consequential mistake of her professional life. She just did not know it yet. Over the next 3 months, I heard things said about me that I still think about sometimes, not because they hurt the way they used to, but because of how effortlessly they were delivered. Comments about having more plastic than a children's toy. Comments calling me fake in more ways than one. A remark that a friend later relayed to me, something Jill had said casually to a colleague at her own desk, that I will not repeat here because putting it back into the world feels like more than it deserves. I asked her to stop. 4 times, spaced across those 3 months. Asterisk here's where I have to own my mistake. And I am going to own it completely. Every single time I confronted Jill, I did it somewhere with no cameras. The elevator, the women's restroom, places where no one was watching and nothing was recorded. I was not thinking about documentation. I was thinking about dignity of mine, and honestly, even hers. I kept believing that if I spoke to her like an adult, she would stop. She did not stop. There was also something else I am less proud of. A part of me was still not ready to tell the full story at work, because telling HR meant explaining the implants. Explaining the implants meant explaining the surgery. And explaining the surgery meant opening a door I had spent 4 years keeping shut. I was not ready to lay that out in front of a company simply because Jill could not keep her mouth closed. So I waited. And Jill read my silence as permission. The Tuesday lunchroom moment of the gesture. The smile. You'd know all about being shallow. That was the moment my patience ran out entirely. I told her everything. Right there at the table, in front of 6 colleagues, in a voice I did not bother lowering. I told her about the specialist's findings, about the surgery, about the scars, about the therapist, and what those first months after the procedure had actually looked like. I told her that the next time she wanted to form an opinion about a decision someone made about their own body, she might want to ask them why they made it first. Then I picked up my food and I walked out. I thought it was a mic drop moment. I genuinely did. What I did not know, what I would not find out until the following morning, was that Jill had walked straight from that lunchroom to her closest friend in HR and filed a formal complaint against me. Let me explain exactly what I was walking into, because I need you to understand the shape of the trap. Jill had got into HR first. Her best friend, a woman I will call Debbie, had been assigned as the reviewer for my case. And if you think that was a coincidence, you and I have very different ideas about how people like Jill operate. She was not panicking. She was not covering her tracks. She was executing a plan she had probably been considering since the lunchroom. She had done this before. I just had not been paying attention. I sat at my desk that evening, read the mail from HR twice, and felt something shift inside me. Not panic. Not even anger. Exactly. Something colder, focused, because somewhere in the back of my memory, a single word surfaced, a word from a section of my employment contract I had read once, 4 years ago, when I first signed it, and never thought about again. Impartial. I went home, pulled out my contract, and found the clause buried in the complaints section, the kind of language that reads like legal filler until the moment you actually need it. It was a contractual right. If I had reasonable grounds to believe my assigned reviewer could not be impartial, I was entitled to request a replacement. They had even given it a name. An impartial overseer. I photocopied that page. I highlighted the clause. I held it in my hand for a moment, And then, I did not allow myself to feel any relief at all because one page was not enough. One page was a speed bump. I needed a wall. I messaged every person who had offered support after the lunchroom incident privately, on a platform separate from anything work-related. I asked each of them one simple question: had Jill said something directly to them, something specific they could remember, something they would be willing to sign their name to? 20 people replied. Not everyone could follow through. Jill had built her position carefully, and some people were genuinely afraid of the fallout. I do not hold that against them. I know exactly what it costs to calculate whether a fight is worth having, but 16 people showed up the following morning with something printed and signed. 16 letters. Specific dates. Specific quotes. Real names. One of them included not just comments about me, but a documented patterned remarks Jill had made about a colleague's weight. Something deeply offensive she had said about another coworker's appearance that crossed a very different kind of line entirely. It turned out Jill had not just made one enemy over the years. She had made it very easy for 16 of them to speak at the same time. I arrived at the office early. I collected every letter, slipped them into a folder alongside my highlighted contract page and my own written timeline of dates and events. And I walked into that HR office carrying everything I needed. What happened next took less than a day to finish building, but it took 4 years to make possible. Debbie was already standing when I walked in, up from her desk, polished, certain, positioned to lead me into the back room where she had clearly planned to end my employment with minimal resistance. The other HR representative sat nearby at her own desk, working on something unrelated. I looked at Debbie. Then I looked at the other rep. So is my meeting with you then? Debbie said no. I told her that was going to be a problem, and I pulled the contract page from my folder before she could say another word. She read it. Her face barely moved, but her eyes did. She told me she could be impartial. I told her I meant no disrespect, but I had solid reason to believe the person on the other end of this complaint was someone she was close to, and my contract gave me the right to request someone else. Respectfully, no drama. She went to find the supervisor. The four of us, the supervisor, the other HR rep, Debbie, and me, sat down together. Debbie stared at me from across that table the way someone stares at a situation they had planned to control and can no longer reach. The supervisor moved through every question you would expect. Why did I believe Jill had filed the complaint? Why had I not come to HR earlier? What exactly had happened in the lunchroom? I answered every question in the same register, steady, factual, and without performing any emotion for anyone in that room. Why did I believe this had been going on for 3 months? I reached into the folder and placed 16 signed statements on the table. 16 different people, 16 sets of specific dates, 16 direct quotes, 16 names. What happened in the lunchroom? There were cameras in that room. The footage would show exactly what happened and in what order. I also had a full list of everyone who had been present at the table that day, including one person who had both witnessed the exchange and written a detailed account of it. Did Jill know about my medical history before that confrontation? No, and I want to be clear, I should not have had to disclose my personal history to a coworker in order to earn the right not to be publicly mocked. No one should ever have to do that. The supervisor stood up. He shook my hand. He sent me back to my desk and told me I would hear from them once they had reviewed everything. I sat down, opened my resume on my screen, and started updating it quietly. Because I have never been naive enough to believe that a folder is bulletproof. Then the interviews started, one by one, beginning with the person who had both written a letter and been present at the lunchroom table. HR called people in 10 minutes each, roughly. Then the others who had been at the table. Then the colleagues who had only written letters. By mid-afternoon it was clear that every single person who had given me a statement had been pulled in for a conversation. Then, finally, Jill was called in. She was in there for 30 minutes. When she came back out, the expression on her face was nothing like the one she had been wearing for the past 3 months. The confidence was gone. The performance was entirely gone. She sat back down at her desk and she stared at me from across the room, and I looked at my screen and kept working. And I did not feel triumph yet. What I felt was something quieter than that. The specific stillness of a room where the air has finally cleared after a very long time. At 4:30, Jill was called back in. At 5 o'clock, she returned. She packed her desk in silence, then began telling anyone within earshot that I had gotten her fired, as if the 16 statements had somehow written themselves, as if the cameras in the lunchroom had been planted specifically for her, as if the clause in my contract had materialized out of nowhere just to inconvenience her afternoon. She shoved her way onto the elevator. The doors closed. 20 minutes later, an email landed in my inbox from her. My case was closed. I sat there for a long moment after I read it, not celebrating, not even exhaling, just sitting with it the way you sit with something that took years to arrive and seconds to end. I thought about the version of me at 24, sitting on a bathroom floor, trying to get through a morning. I thought about how carefully I had carried that story for 4 years, how much I had done to keep it protected and private and mine. I thought about Jill spending 3 months treating my body like a punchline in the break room, in the hallways, at lunch, to anyone who would listen. And I thought about the fact that what ultimately brought her down was not my anger, not the confrontation in the lunchroom, not even the medical history she had forced me to lay out in front of a table full of colleagues. It was a single clause in a contract she had never thought to read. One highlighted sentence. One photocopied page. The detail she had never considered. The room she had never looked for. The rule that had been sitting there quietly for 4 years just waiting. She walked into a structure that was already built. And she walked in like she owned every inch of it. She did not own any of it. I did.